Well, good afternoon, everybody. I want to try and give you a sense of where we're going in what I call the new tobacco wars. I'm going to look at a bunch of different areas, try and give you an overview picture of what's happening. The first area I want to look at is science. And the way I see a lot of the science that's coming out of the tobacco control community is a kind of desperate search for harm. And I think the reason for that is that without harm, there wouldn't be a tobacco control. It would be like coffee or caffeine. So harm and the pursuit of harm is really, really important. And we're seeing a number of abuses now that I think are involved in that pursuit. The first is terrible use of toxicology. For example, tiny traces of metals being talked up into a significant health risk. Abuse of cell studies, in vitro studies, where findings are being, if you like, over-interpreted into human health effects. Huge exposures to animals, and then the findings again interpreted as human health risks. But above all, I think the biggest problem is in this one, which is the abuse of correlation and causation. And I'm just going to give an example, happens to be the most recent, but not the worst, which is somebody who'd done a study finding a relationship between vaping and bone fractures. Okay. And it was an association, but it was spun as a press release, which was that e-cigarette use may be detrimental to bone health. So it went from an association to causation. But look at the limitations section in this. They first of all highlighted the fact it was cross-sectional and they couldn't make causal inferences. They highlighted the fact that there was residual confounding, which there would be. They highlighted the fact that they didn't really know what the exposure was. And then, most absurd of all, they pointed out that some of the e-cigarette use may have happened after the bone fractures that they had counted. But none of that stopped them making a causal claim in a press release that came out before the paper. And we're seeing way too much of that, in my view. Okay, let me go on to risk communication. Here are people who are purporting to provide the public with what they call vape facts. Here are some vape facts. Vaping is as safe as skydiving without a parachute. Now, that is obviously wrong. Skydiving without a parachute causes instant and immediate certain death. Okay, that's not what vaping does, but that's a normal form of communication here, posing as facts. Let's look at another example. Here's one from the FDA talking about nicotine use, but they've linked it to some kind of weird worm effect in the face, and then something that looks like an alien chrysalis in the middle of the poster, which I don't know what it's designed to do other than cause a kind of panic. There's no informational content in this. It's just a scare story. Moving on, nicotine is brain poison. I'm sorry, but it isn't. It isn't brain poison. There are millions and millions of adults that have grown up as teenage smokers who have never had any lasting negative effects from nicotine. Maybe effects from smoke, but definitely not from nicotine. Let me pick on a particularly egregious case. This is published in the Sun newspaper, the most widely circulated tabloid in the United Kingdom, talking about snus. Look at this example here. Difficult to read, so I'm going to blow it up. Tobacco firms promote snus as safer than smoking, but whether you jump from the 10th story of a building or the 20th, the effect is the same. Yes, that's probably true, but it's not a good analogy for snus and cigarettes. In fact, the LD50 for jumping out of a building is about the 4th floor. So 50% of people who jump from the 4th floor would die, about the same as from smoking. And using snus would be more or less the same as walking down the stairs. Completely false, inappropriate characterization, the relative risk. Let me move on. Iwali is a scandal in my view here. Around 68 people died. 2,800 were hospitalized in an outbreak of severe lung episodes concentrated in North America. the pattern of this outbreak was consistent with localized supply chain contamination. In other words, it rose and then fell sharply and disappeared by February 2000. And in fact, we know that that's the case. It was supply chain contamination, vitamin E acetate contaminating the supply chain for cannabis, illicit cannabis vapes. It was nothing to do with nicotine, nothing at all. Yet a large campaign was put in place, deliberate in my view, to conflate the two things. And sad to say, it worked. We now have, and this is in the United Kingdom, so it's not even the country where it happened, there was a surge in people who thought that vaping was as harmful or more harmful than smoking, up to a third in Britain, and a contraction in the number of people who rightly think it was much less. Okay. And then finally on the risk communication, what I call the big lie. This is published just a couple of weeks ago in the Brussels Times. Look at what they're saying here. These products are falsely marketed as safer and more sustainable options to deadly cigarettes. What they're basically saying is that e-cigarettes, heated tobacco products, are no different to deadly cigarettes. And this isn't just some mad ranter in Brussels. This is over 40 organizations and professors from all continents, according to the authors themselves. It's a big lie. Let's go on to policy making. I want to give 3 examples here of really bad policy making in the field. The first is the lust for prohibition. This is a position statement of the Union, a respiratory charity funded by Bloomberg Philanthropies, which promotes prohibition of e-cigarettes and heated tobacco products, and probably anything it can, in low and medium income countries. Now, those low and medium income countries cover the bulk of the world's smokers. 800 million smokers, in the view of this respiratory organization, ought to be denied access to these products. WHO, shocking, is offering awards for prohibition. And here we go. This was an award made on World No Tobacco Day to the Health Minister of India for the legislation to ban e-cigarettes and heated tobacco products. Now, note here, there's no evaluation of whether this was successful or a good idea or had unintended consequences. It was an award for the legislation. The policy was the thing that mattered. And it's worse than a normal drug prohibition. It's more like a prohibition of clean needles. You're actually prohibiting something that would have a health benefit to people who switch to using it. WHO should know about the dangers of prohibition because it did a report on the prohibition of tobacco in Bhutan, which has always been the sort of poster child of prohibitionists. Okay, now this is, you can't read this, but this is the forward from the WHO rep to Bhutan. I'm going to blow up what he said here because it's very illustrative. Today, the country is facing the challenge of illegal traffic in tobacco and its products. And it's a key line next. So long as the demand within the country persists, it will continue to fuel the illicit market, which has grown. And then, unfortunately, Bhutanese youth are at the center of this growing illicit trade. So not only has this policy failed, but it's basically involved young people in the criminal supply chain. Now, you can study the literature on prohibition, alcohol, drugs, other prohibitions, and you would never do it. And to be honest, if you're too lazy to do that, you could always switch to the Netflix series Narcos and get a more entertaining view of how prohibitions work in practice. Okay, another policy, banning e-liquid flavors. This is sort of prohibition light. This sort of aims to render the product kind of unattractive. Could something go wrong? Of course it could, because mostly adults who are vaping are using flavors other than tobacco flavors. And what's going to happen to them? About that, the proponents of flavor bans are silent. And will it work for young people? Well, the intended outcome is that young people will be abstinent from nicotine, vaping, smoking, and any other substance use. But is that the only option available to them? No, of course it isn't. There's like 1,000 different things that they could do in response to a ban on flavors, okay, including smoking, including the black market, including mixing their own, including workarounds, including imports, so on, okay. Who is thinking about the real world behavioral response? And we already know this is a possibility. Here's a study from San Francisco of a ban that was introduced 1st of January 2019. In this, you can see that teenage smoking increased following the e-cigarette ban introduced in San Francisco, but not in other districts. Now, has this caused anybody to pause and think, actually, maybe this is a dumb idea? No, it hasn't. And that's because the policy is the point. The prohibition is the point. It's nothing to do with the actual health outcomes. Let's look at another policy, taxing vapes. Okay. The US currently is debating a federal e-cigarette tax, okay, that in at least one manifestation would raise e-cigarette taxes to a level comparable to cigarette taxes. Okay. Now, brilliant letter, and I have great respect for this guy, Mike Pesco, written to everyone in Congress, highlights the effect of this. And I'm just going to take you through it now. 2.7% reduction in teen e-cigarette use, but 2 in 3 of the teens who no longer use cigarettes would start to smoke instead. Okay, that would give 500,000 extra teenage smokers. It would raise the number of, would reduce adult vaping by 2.5 million, but increase adult smoking by about the same number. And for every e-cigarette pot it eliminated, 5.5 extra packs of cigarettes would be sold instead. Now, who could possibly think that is a win? But are the people pushing this, and they're all in the public health side, are they looking at this and going, hang on a minute, we ought to pause and think a bit? Okay, moving on, kids. Now, these aren't the kind of kids that are actually at risk from vaping. These are sort of weaponized kids that are used in anti-vaping campaigns. But I don't have long to spend on this. But what we had in the US was a kind of moral panic, a youth vaping epidemic story in which vaping rose to 27.5%. But it then fell again. Okay. Now, has anyone cancelled the youth vaping epidemic? No, they haven't. Has anybody thought about what this means for the kids that are most at risk? Not the kids in the tobacco-free kids t-shirts, but the kids that are actually at risk. These are the kids who would otherwise smoke or would otherwise use other substances. For them, vaping may have been beneficial, but nobody seems to care about that. Now, where is the opposition coming from? That's the underlying question here. Why do we see this? And I want to rule out something here, which is it's just a good faith difference of opinion on what is the right thing to do. And the reason why I say that is if it was in good faith, the opposition to vaping and tobacco harm reduction would look very different. It would be consumed by concerns about trade-offs, about unintended consequences, about particular population groups, about the appropriate objectives. And yet we see none of that, nothing at all. So I think there are 2 main reasons. First of all, cultural inertia. The people who've been doing this for years have a playbook, and that playbook is statist, coercive, and punitive. And he finds expression in the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control. It's about restrictions, about punishment, about stigma. It's about forcing you out of smoking using the power of the state. It also has a powerful, useful nemesis, the tobacco industry, which looms large in this world. And a lot of people conceive of themselves as warriors in battle against an evil industry. And that's a very hard culture to shake off. The second area, I think, the reasons for this opposition is what I call institutional inertia. A massive machine was constructed to fight smoking, consistent of research infrastructure, a whole international treaty, conferences and so on, regulators who are deeply involved in regulating and engaged in this, philanthropists that have put over $1 billion into it, philanthropists that are also very influential and under the skin of WHO, huge coalitions of organizations that have been formed around this as a massive infrastructure. And you put those two things together, the cultural inertia and the institutional inertia, and you have a very formidable complex that is dedicated to fighting smoking, and now, in my opinion, has sort of swiveled its gun turrets onto the new thing and is now blasting away. Finally, I'm going to finish with reasons why I'm actually optimistic. Basically, we have a recreational stimulant, nicotine. It's quite popular. A lot of people don't like the idea that it's popular, but it is. And we've had major innovation in the way that it can be used, driven by battery technology that allows for electrical heating rather than combustion as the way of forming an aerosol. People, including me, have compared that to the evolution of the auto industry from petrol engines to electric vehicles, and the evolution of the energy industry from fossil fuels to renewables. But I think the most interesting innovation story is music. And just bear with me on this for a second. There's been an amazing technology transition in music. We started off with analog. We have a technology advance that allows us to go to CDs, digital. We have another technology advance, storage chips, that allows us to go to downloads. And we have a final technology advance, bandwidth, that allows us to go to cloud services. Now, the interesting thing about these technology advances is that at each time the user gets a benefit, and therefore there's a rapid uptake and an obsoleting of the technology that came before. And I think that's what's going to happen with tobacco. We now have products that have great advantages to the user compared to what came before. And if we got behind it, those products, the cigarettes, the smoking products, would be rapidly obsoleted. And so for me, the question is, do you see this as an opportunity or a threat? And if you see it as a threat, who is the threat to? Whose interests really are threatened by this? It's not consumers and it's not the public. And my final slide, a quote from the great late Calestus Juma: claims about the promise of new technology are at times greeted with skepticism, vilification, outright opposition, often dominated by slander, innuendo, scare tactics, conspiracy theories, and misinformation. Now, you see where I'm going with this? The assumption that new technologies carry unknown risks guides much of the debate. And this is often amplified to levels that overshadow the dangers of known risks. Okay, now this is why I think we will prevail in the end, because in the end, the underlying benefits of these technologies will prevail, and all of this noise and vitriol will subside, be forgotten, and we'll have a more sensible way of using nicotine. With that, I'd like to thank you.